I think it's timely to say good evening to those who might be connected. I think a nice little test to show signs of life would be a little, if people have a little hello message in the chat function. Be nice to see anyone who wants to say hello pop up. It's a good test of the way to ask questions. And hello, Patrick. Good of you to go first. Now, we're definitely going to give people just a few minutes to chime in. So I'm not going to pretend I'm on TV just trying to fill empty airspace. So we're probably just going to give this a couple of minutes to drift by while you can take in the serene sight of the Acropolis on our orange background. I hope people have come armed with questions. Oh, and now we have a convenient green bubble telling people how to ask questions. Okay, so we're expecting about 70 people tonight. I'm actually not going to wait for 70 people to say hello along the way. I wanted to get a good sense that people were punctual and timely, and I can clearly see 10 or so have popped up straight away. There's a fabulous saying, if you hear from 10 people, it generally means 50 are there. So I'm going to draw out those numbers. So firstly, good evening. Hello. I'm joining you from the fabulous Novotel St Kilda. So appreciate the surroundings. And later on, you're going to hear from Kyle in my team, who is back at the New Democracy offices in Sydney. The original idea for this actually came from a webinar we had just a few months ago. And it was designed for people who really wanted to be active and contributing something to how we do democracy better. And we started to notice, wow, there's a lot of questions just not about us talking, some really blunt questions that people want to put to us. So that's really the theme for tonight. I want to give you a 15-minute step through of just the basics of who we are as an organisation, where we came from, give you a sense of the team, and what it is, the principles we believe in and are espousing to government. And then we'll step through that for about 15 minutes time, and then leave, 15, 20 minutes open to your questions. Now, you can ask them as you go, exactly how you've been introducing yourself. It's very useful and helpful if you can add things with a little question symbol, because it helps me to be able to scroll back and find them. But we'll go through that and we'll leave 20 or so minutes for questions. With the remainder of the time, particularly Kyle, who some of you may have chatted with or seen exposed through our Facebook group, he will come in and actually we'll start to give you the handoff of, for those of you who are active and keen, well, what is it I can do? We're getting better at answering that question and knowing what it is that really connects with MPs, mayors, ministers, who actually want to do something different, who want to find a better way to make public decisions. Now, before I jump straight in, the holding slide just dropped out. Hopefully you're still with me everywhere. Firstly is who is in the team. I've run New Democracy for about 6.5 years now. My name's Iain. With me has been Georgina Inwood, who actually came to us from a council from Canada Bay from the first project that we worked together on. We also have Kyle Redman on the full-time staff. Kyle has an irritatingly deep degree of detailed understanding of electoral systems, politics and government, so came to us with a fabulous list of degrees he will no doubt add to over the years. Beyond that, we also have a community of people who help us out in, people who actually came to us as volunteers. From Manuela, who was my first letter writer, who actually started to write just her own stream of thoughts through to Malcolm Turnbull and started to get an answer. And we've started to see the efficacy of people just asking honest questions through letters and not through the campaigned form letters we see in traditional campaigning. Some of you will also be familiar with Toby and Nivek, also volunteers, particularly in the online and social media area. And Dennis is our technology host for tonight, which simply means if your screen goes black, Dennis, we're looking at you. Now, the starting point is I get a lot of, why haven't I heard of you guys over the last however many years? What have you been doing so quietly? I'm interested in this field. Where have you come from? Now, the short answer of where we've come from is we're a privately funded research foundation. Essentially, our large underwriting donor is Luca Belgiorno-Nettis. And Luca's father started Transfield. He had a lot of exposure to political donors over the years. He went to a lot of fundraising dinners pretty much since he could walk. And at one of those fundraising dinners, he simply said, I think we need to take money out of how we do democracy. Now, from that starting point, it turns out taking money out of democracy may help a little bit, but it's very hard to do. You could ban every political donation tomorrow, and large special interests will simply buy media outlets or buy a heck of a lot of airtime on those media outlets. So you can't take just a simple approach. We look at both the origins of democracy in Greece and also what are the trusted public institutions today. And one of those is the jury. I'd really challenge you to think about, if you hear that someone's been tried on a serious crime and you see the results in the newspaper, whether they're guilty or not guilty, your first reaction is not, gee, they must have had the wrong connection. They must have given a donation in a certain place. Gee, he's had a good position which protected him from something. No, you'll tend to think, wow, a group of people like me looked at a huge array of information and they managed to find common ground. It's an institution that we trust. So if we trust juries to send people to jail potentially for 25 years, life in prison, can we not also trust juries in a slightly different format? Can we trust those juries to make some public decisions? Critically, if we look at the world, if an elected leader of either party was to stand up and say, here is a decision we need to take, if there was a cross-section of people like us from the community standing next to them saying, we've looked at this in detail, this is fair enough. It's a way to get beyond the wish list approach and start to get into the trade-offs. So as New Democracy, we try to show, don't tell. The new areas of democracy are not something people can really easily get their head around. So we try to get governments to run projects that they give us something for people to look at and poke and say, this worked well, this didn't. We're a research foundation and we try and we incrementally refine the methodology. That's why when, a big part of my job is to walk around and ask people, tell me what's hard. We talk specifically with MPs, those in elected office, and say, tell us what's hard. Last year, the Office of the Premier of South Australia came back and said, we're thinking of building a 138,000-tonne high-level nuclear waste facility. Fabulous. What a great opportunity to test whether you can take a trusted public decision in that field. We never take a policy position. We don't care if people do something or don't do something. If we work in a council area on rates, we don't care if citizens want to double rates or halve them. We simply don't have a policy position. And I know people can come to us and say, gosh, I really care about a specific issue. But I must say, that's great. But the main reason is we are about process. I'm getting a couple of one or two comments popping up, inquiring about the sound. If someone on the chat can let me know if there's an issue, but it sounds fabulous in this hotel room. Now, what is it that we actually try to apply? And this is really central to our belief in what's wrong with democracy. I'd really encourage a starting point for you to be, what's the problem? What problem are we trying to fix? Now, we think we have a pretty clear answer to this question. We think we've built a system that is very, very responsive to public opinion. And public opinion is what you think off the top of your head. We do opinion polls where we ask people what they think when they haven't had time to think. And again, to go back to the jury analogy, picture yourself being arrested. No one would insist on saying, I want a poll of 1,000 people tomorrow to determine whether I go to jail. But that is a really good analogy. Why are we making decisions based on shallowness? We would like to replace public opinion with public judgment. Simply put, what is deliberation? It's a chance, it's the opportunity where a group of people have equal share of voice and the widest possible access to information. It's just very simple. If we can do those two things well, then we improve the standard of public decisions. If people start from a point of view of, I just don't like politicians, they're all awful, doing corrupt things, etc., that's not a starting point that we take. So particularly when people come to me and say, I have this fabulous tool, it's going to enable every citizen to click to vote on everything. Think about the two different outlooks that you have as if you look at democratic reform. If you start from the point of view that public opinion is the problem, then you don't really want to have a giant public opinion tool. If you do start from the point of view that politicians they don't mean well, then it probably looks like a fabulous solution. And that's probably our first step. We do get a close enough exposure to it. We think the real distortion comes in from elections. Have you ever noticed how much you tend to like and see reason in people who are retired politicians? It's because they're not facing the artificial impairment on judgment that comes from elections. So what are these 5 principles? The 5 principles we believe in are random selection, information, time, authority, and a blank sheet. And I want to step through these briefly. Random selection simply means, are we talking to a representative group from the community? We think our parliaments, the phrase I heard this week was male, pale and stale, and I can say that. How do we get a group of people? We will trust people like us to make decisions. And that really tends to be, how do we get a really representative group? Now, traditionally, governments ask people for input. And when they ask for that input, you hear from a self-selected group. You don't hear from a representative group. There are many ways to get to a representative group, but random selection is a very simple and effective one. If you picture reaching your hand into a jar of jelly beans, you won't pull out all the red ones. You will pull out a cross-section. In our methodologies, we don't do a perfect analogy to just jury notices which go out. We do stratified random selection. And what this means is we follow approximately the census profile by age, by gender, and by whether people own or rent their homes. It's a really nice way to get a distribution of income and education levels. The best test for this recruitment is particularly for politicians, but it's open to anyone. Come along. You actually see a jury process operating, and consistently what we hear from people in elected office or heads of government departments is, wow, this looks like completely different to the people we would normally hear from in our engagement. Governments tend to hear from the most highly active interests. So if you can picture a public project where government might have asked for input, there's probably a bell curve of views out there in the community. Who does government hear from? 2 edges. Government, we want you to do this. The world will end if you do what they want. Our point of view with random selection is we will get views all the way up and across that curve. Secondly, if that group of people representing many different interests and backgrounds and life experiences and occupations, the art here is not to give government 2 disparate sets of views. It's to challenge people to say, where can you find common ground? What is it you can agree on? Because this is about, democracy is not about voting and counting and tallying and running the numbers. Democracy is an exercise in taking public decisions that are trusted and help us to achieve social cohesion. Our aspiration is to see decisions taken where the vast majority of the population looks at something and says, well, I guess that's fair enough. That's really the test we're applying to success. I'm not sure you'd see that in a lot of some of the more simple click-to-vote models. So that first principle is representativeness and random selection. The second area that we look at is information. Now, this is really critical. People can often strive to say, how do you check and verify that this is the most accurate or neutral information? There is no neutral information. Every source has a point of view. So our approach is, in any decision, can we expose people to a number of sources? Can we get that breadth of hearing the views of others? If you're going to make a decision on a complex issue around energy, hear not just from people you agree with in wind or solar, but hear from people in coal or coal seam gas. It's that breadth of views and understanding a number of perspectives and exposing that to this diverse group of people that will help ensure that the decision is not just based on essentially a groupthink approach. Central to this is we always ask active interests, make your case to this group of people. Generally, they'd rather make their case to that group of people than to just keep banging their heads against the door with government. Well, for anyone out there, thank you for persevering. Believe it or not, we had a tool that worked wonderfully well. It was a happy tool. And then we upgraded. One of those fabulous things when you go, no, upgrading does sound better, and it's not. So my apologies to how we've asked you to spend your evening thus far. If people could chime in on chat just so we get some sense of people reconnecting would be really helpful at this point. Any sign of life given the 15 minutes of technical sadness that we have sent through. So my apologies. Now, in the best interests of everyone's time, I have mixed messages about where the sound and video and everything went completely astray. I'm just going to give you a 2-minute snapshot, and I'd really like to jump in the questions. The question on really topical, hot questions. And I will never try and subject people to technology ever again as a result of this, but thank you for staying with us through 15 minutes of dancing monkeys. For those of you who left me at various departed times, I just wanted to give you a simple sense of our methodology. Things vary, but at the core of this is, hopefully you got a sense of, we take randomly selected groups of people because they're representative from all walks of life. We expose them to an array of diverse sources in the room, specialist speakers, documents, videos, anything that the active interests want to put there, and let them choose from it. We give people immense amounts of time. Our projects are commonly operational for about 4 months. Some of the things we are discussing with the federal government would run even longer. You don't get great decisions by having people take decisions straight at the top of their head. Selection in everyday people. We love this phrase about rational ignorance. If you're 1/16 millionth of a say, of course you don't read the Henry Tax Review or the IPCC report. If I make you one of 50 people and you get a straight answer from the Premier, you'll probably read a whole heck of a lot more. You'll probably actively and work to find what the common ground is. And the last point is, it's really important, is about governments not trying to sell answers, but about sharing problems. And the example that I gave that I'm pretty sure nobody heard as a result of our lovely technology was simply this. I want you to picture the Commission of Audit 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, Tony Shepherd stands up and says, everyone needs to pay $7 to go to the doctor. And it lasts about a day. Now, the problem is real. There is a health system that gets more and more expensive. But the approach is not simply to say, here is my answer and you shall like it, because, well, as we saw from that, it didn't last very long. Our approach would be to encourage governments to simply ask the question, how can we pay for the health system we want? And if we ask a representative group of people that question, if we give them access to a diverse array of sources from the medical industry, the AMA, from university professors, from people in social services, from people in really specialized areas throughout the medical system, and a jury of citizens gets the chance to hear that and apply critical thinking to that questioning and have authority to report that to the Parliament and the Health Minister, then I think the Parliament starts to become informed by a group that is not simply a special interest. Today, those lobbied interests go directly to MPs, go directly to ministers behind closed doors, and we don't trust the results. And if they do come up with a policy idea they really like the look of, we as citizens don't trust it because, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? There's a lot of self-interest at work. The jury model works because it gets beyond narrow self-interest. It's hard for either side of politics or any media outlet to look at these groups of people and say anything other than, gosh, you're our readers, you're our viewers. And hopefully that's, you get a sense of the aspirations we have for where we think the direction democratic reform should take. So I've seen the first question pop up, and I'm really keen that we prioritize time for questions that we have. So I'd like to spend about 10 minutes on the questions and then 10 minutes with Kyle for the really meaningful areas to answer that one simple question we get, which is, what can I do to help? Between Kyle and I, we think we have some good answers to that. So particularly for the devoted who've borne with us, this is a great chance to explore that. So I've got a question from Patrick, which looks about how do you move from a jury outcome to an enacted public policy and that the jury thinking is faithfully reflected. There's two really key components to how we answer that question. Firstly, negotiate authority up front. Quite often when someone in elected office is speaking to you right on that first day, they feel the problem. You know, we're asking them, tell us a problem that's been there for 10 years. They are looking for an active solution. And when we balance that and say, well, we have a method that can take citizens through this, that should result of them finding common ground, well, then this is our expectation. Now, Premier Wetherell has been one of the best in terms of us getting an agreed level of authority. And I want you to picture this as a citizen. You're getting asked a hard public policy issue, Patrick, and the Premier says, I will respond to you in person for an hour. I'll give you a formal written response within 30 days. And as an act of good faith for transparency and to make sure that things don't get tricked up and edited, your report will go live and unedited into the Parliament. So it will be tabled into the Parliament. So there's no opportunity for a government agency or elected official to actually be able to trick it up or stage it. When we have citizens who write their own reports, they write them live, no consultant touches it. If they finish at 4:30 on Saturday, we've sent it live at 4:35. I'm getting a couple of messages that people are losing, but we're going to press on. I've got a question from Kathy from earlier. How do we go about framing the question or issue to be put before a jury? And how do we facilitate an outcome? So how do we get people to find common ground? Kathy, you're right. Framing is actually the hardest thing that we face. In essence, the triggers that we're looking at are, I want to ask a plain English question, which is open. It doesn't guide a response down one path. To go to the budgetary questions that were asked earlier, it's a really nice starting point to ask people, do we think council spends money on the right things? And if not, what should we do? It's a man in the street question. You need the everyday person to look at this and say, that's a question I want to answer and tell my elected representatives. We have like simple questions such as, how can we live within our means? In infrastructure, what are our main priorities and how do we pay for them? So you start to see that they're very practical in orientation, plain English in approach. In terms of facilitating an outcome, you're right. I often hear the comment, you can't get 5 people to agree on ordering takeaway food. How are you going to get 40 people to find common ground? And the answer to this is very much, we let people go broad first. They'll spend 2 or 3 days across a month and a half really trying to broaden their knowledge, ask good questions and expand their array of thinking as to how they'll solve the problem. But in terms of writing up the solution, as they've written it themselves, we really like this test of, can I live with it? And so if you take a 5-point, love it, like it, live with it, lament it, and loathe it, we're trying to find and get people to cluster, obviously 80% plus in the higher end of the scale. And if I was to say, we're going to make a recommendation that everyone should go outside and play in the sun, someone might say, I can't live with that. So the response is, what would it take in order for you to be able to live with it? And they might say, I want everyone to go out in the sun except for between 12 and 2 o'clock. We then retest that statement with the entire group. We're trying to find those areas of common ground, and we'll actually absolutely come with nuance. So that's really the core part of our methodology when it comes to how we find that common ground. I'm going to jump to a question from Bob, which is about what protects a jury from being externally influenced from stakeholders. Cracking question. We've had a few attempts to defraud our recruitment over the years. The cycling jury in South Australia was the number one for people who didn't get an invitation, trying to flood our RSVP system. Contrary to appearances, we have some quite good IT systems for that, so we can catch and match people who haven't actually been selected. Bob, the core of it is large numbers. If you take 40 people who don't know each other and you are a special interest trying to influence that group, we're looking for 80% of the room to agree to it, which is 32 people. But let's take a view of saying you're trying to block something. So you need to find 9 people who disagree. You have 3 weeks in between meetings. Getting to 9 people and actually successfully co-opting them or feeding them information or scaring them into a particular decision is very, very difficult. I say impossible. We've certainly seen in one of the council projects, one lady came in and she had reams of information that had probably come from a very active special interest. Think about how you'd respond to that as well. You'd be, oh, that's interesting. Where did you get that? The group has a very good skill at policing and being able to ask critical questions as to why someone might have changed dramatically from one meeting to the next and what influences they have there. Overall, the key protection is numbers, both on if you look at where it goes wrong in criminal juries, well, they only need 2 people to hang a jury. So it's a smaller manipulation. We need 8 or 9, and the dynamics are fundamentally different. I'd emphasize also that our processes are open. So it's a really good chance for people to come and watch. So if you're an active interest, whether that's an industry interest or a community group, it's a chance for people to actually, if you give them an open door and a front door, by which to participate in the system, we tend to see that they don't take the chance to co-opt or do the wrong thing. They participate to the front door rather than the back. I'm going to jump back to a question from Rob from earlier, which is, how are information providers selected? And how influential is this, or how important is it? The first point of information is government itself. Government commissions it. Government is the host organisation. So a government agency will produce a background document of generally 80 to 100 pages, which sets the scene to say, this is our view of the world. We then ask them, what's a list of all the stakeholders who've been in touch with you on this issue? Who is it who is dying to have a say? That list will be 200 to 300 individuals or organisations. We do a stakeholder briefing to explain the methodology and invite them to essentially make your case to this group. It can be a 5-minute video. It can be a 2 or 3 page summary document. It may refer to longer reports, but it's key that they make their case in a concise form. Now, from that, what you're explicitly seeing is, we do not curate a group. We don't exclude some and include others. We are very much about make your case to all. As a research foundation, we took an interesting opportunity to do a process on alcohol reform in South Australia with Premier Wetherell, and 3 months later in New South Wales with Premier O'Farrell. And what was interesting is the Australian Hotels Association, as a clear active interest, approached each jury completely differently. In the South Australian jury, they provided report after report after report, and a huge amount of time and work went into it as they made their case. And the jury read it, and in summary form, read through everything and said, wow, now we know how they feel in their view of the world. And they didn't ask them for further information. It would be safe to say the AHA didn't love not being asked for further information. So as the Sydney project came around, they didn't provide anything. There was no submission, no video, no documents. You can probably pick as a jury, they discussed, what do we need to know? Who do we trust to inform us? And they said, well, if you're going to look at alcohol regulation, well, we've got to hear from the AHA. So we made the request formally, and of course they provided a lot of materials, as they did in the first one. They sent along a speaker who answered questions. As people applied their critical thinking and said, well, back that up, they referenced the reports. And it was the AHA who came out the back of it and said, it's funny, because of time, one way or another, information comes out in the end. It is not an audit. It is not every source, but by and large, it's enough time for a very large diverse array of sources to come together. The key is we never curate. As long as something is not libelous or dangerous, we don't pull anything. We redact personal details, nothing else. There was a question from Jamie regarding juries that deliberate on actual spend in context. Jump on our website and have a project. The City of Melbourne had come to us with a really simple problem, which was everyone running for office promised immense capital works, resulting in a $400 million a year council. $250 comes from rates, $1.22 billion overspend for 10 years. So $120 million a year in round numbers was going to be a very, very big impost on a budget. We asked a group of citizens fundamentally, how can we live within our means? That was the core 10-year budgeting process. The key point to take away is it was Stephen Mayne, as an independent councillor, who said, it's not that we as a council couldn't have taken that decision. It's that we couldn't even have the discussion. We couldn't have a discussion about rates and budget because you're either raising taxes and that's bad, or you're cutting public services or privatising an asset. All solutions look bad at an opinion level, but we still need to address them. I've got a question from Eden. Does the New Democracy Foundation give talks or presentation to groups, clubs, universities, meetups? Broadly, yes. I try to go to all sorts of places. It's a really good way to test. Does the idea resonate with people? Do people look at it and test it and trust it? Obviously, we try to tie this in with an existing travel rota. So if we're in Canberra, if we're in Queensland, we tie that in. It's really useful, especially if the group organising this, particularly if you can invite your local MP, a mayor along, it's a greater chance for them to see a diverse group of people talking, but also make a connection to a group of people who can respond with the pressures of elected office and look at where it's practical to apply this and where it isn't. Our methodology is slow, expensive, and high risk. Partly why it earns public trust when it's correctly operated, but it is a little bit terrifying for those in elected office to take on. Eden, send us an email. Email addresses are on the website. Mine is predictable, ian.walker@newdemocracy.com.au. Kyle is also an aspiring public speaker and will tread the stage. I'm going to jump to a question from Luke. I've just realised I cut off what Kyle was meant to talk about, but we press on. Question from Luke. Randomly selected juries have an option to opt out. Does this bias those selected towards a particular demographic? Yes. There is no perfect random selection. So even though the Sheriff's Office compels you to turn up, criminal juries skew low. By demographics, the average jury is at a lower level of education and income compared to the society as a whole. In short, those who can get out of it do get out of it. Our initial problem about 6 or 7 years ago was that our juries skewed high. Our juries absolutely skewed towards, there were too many people who were tertiary educated. It very much appeals to people who are quiet and data-driven. We're aware that we get a lot of people who they simply would never run for office, and this is an appealing outlet. We tested various approaches. We've done two main things. Firstly, we always pay participants, about $100, $120 a day. And that really helps with accessibility for people with a disability, young people who have to skip a shift, people who need to get childcare. There's a very visible change that you get when you pay participants. It's not enough to retire on a skewer decision. And as we like to point out, everyone else in public decision making gets paid. You don't notice the Senate doing it for free. We don't tend to see a big subject matter bias. If we were going to get a rampant skew, we would see it in some of the deliberately hard issues we've taken on. I think a good 60% of the room just likes the idea of democratic innovation and doing something different. Again, the key in this is these do not run on one loud person. It's not 40 people in a room like a town hall meeting and the two loudest people go head to head. The dynamic is in small groups. So, of course, you'll get a couple of people passionate about the topic, but it washes out in the mix. Thomas is being revolutionary and asking if we can use citizens' juries to replace politicians and elections altogether. It's an option. We try not to come across as lunatics. People like voting. We may think it's a terrible mechanism that leads to terrible behaviours. And a lot of the phrase innovation sometimes is crawl, walk, run. For now, what we really want is for elected leaders to stand alongside and see a role for a community that is not just protesting and shouting, that is not just going off the hook, but who are thinking, who are finding common ground and are actually willing to stand alongside them in the taking of hard decisions. I'm very mindful of time and the need to hear, hopefully, what else that you can do that's active. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time with Kyle. Hopefully this has given you an operational taste of what we do. Excuse me. It won't be the last webinar we do, maybe the last one on this platform, but this is not your one-shot opportunity. But I would love to spend some time on answering that one question, well, what is it you can do? Now, as I buzz around the place with politicians, one of my wonderful project people, Kyle Redman, Kyle has taken this on because he's magic with technology. He understands the world of Facebook communications and frankly has a passion for answering the questions that I wasn't able to answer. So Kyle, I'd like to bring you in now. What is it that people can do to help?
So Iain's done a lot of talking about sort of what we do, and I just want to talk a bit about what everyone else can do. We created the Demos as a space for discussion and collaboration on all things new democracy, but also as a place for action. In the past, we haven't really been able to point our enthusiastic supporters in the right direction and sort of fire that cannon of enthusiasm at the targets we want. But with the Demos, we're here to give you the tools and show you their specific uses in directly helping new democracy change the way we do democracy. This might mean helping us land projects by lobbying the right minister or raising our visibility in the right forums or outlets, and essentially making you a really crucial arm of our operations. I'm just going to quickly step through, mindful of time, a couple of examples of the ways that you can help us, and we'll help you help us through the demos and by giving you material. The first is really getting the word out. Letters to the editor, comments on Facebook and on publication websites. These are really useful in raising our visibility to people reading certain newspapers and web pages. We're going to follow up this webinar with some helpful pointers for letters and specific newspapers or websites that are good targets for you to write to. The second is name dropping New Democracy in conversation with friends and discussion circles. Bring up New Democracy whenever you hear someone dissatisfied with government or politicians. Invite them to the demos, bring them into the tent. You might want to host an event, which could just be coffee or a meal, or have a discussion with wider friends and family. But just bring up New Democracy, get them involved, sort of share the idea. Iain mentioned before just ways in which we could, does New Democracy talk at events and stuff? Invite us along, get us in. We can speak it and share our ideas. What we'll do is we'll also follow up with some material similar to the letter to the editor. We'll follow up with some talking points, help you sort of get across the topic, be able to share our ideas and inform others. The third, and one of the more crucial ones, is similar to the letter to the editor. Get in touch with your local MPs. Demand that they trust, that you can trust in their decisions. And one of the key ways that you can do that is through citizen juries. So you write similar letters to the editor and send your letters to your MPs. Genuine letters of concern like that are really helpful in us landing projects. They see that actual people are into this democratic reform, and it's not just nerds like Iain and I. We'll follow up similar with the other things, some pointers for writing these letters, key politicians to target, people who are sort of targets of ours and are super influential. Another awesome way you can help us is just by volunteering. You can just share your talent with us, and we can point you in the right direction. Things like writing fact sheets, helping spread the word by just good one-pagers to hand to politicians, or helping out on the demos by sort of coordinating other people writing letters to the editor, keeping the conversation going, that kind of thing. That's sort of a really quick, speedy blitz through those core sort of aspects of what you can do to help us. We'll, as I sort of mentioned, we'll reinforce this with some material that'll help you do that. But I think we're wrapping up to 7:30 now, and I'm mindful of keeping everyone here. If we haven't got to everyone's questions, what we'll do is we'll answer the ones that we've missed in the demos. So we'll post those on the demos. And if you've got any more questions, that's a good place to ask them again. What we'll do is we'll just keep that conversation rolling, keep asking any questions you've got. There's been some really good questions here, and people shouldn't hesitate to ask them in the demos. There are lots of people who definitely have questions, don't ask them, and you're probably speaking their mind. I might just pass back to Iain to close out, just ticking on 7:30.
Thank you, Kyle. And for those of you with us, firstly, we'll probably use a different tool next time. So thank you for bearing with us through a technological little heartache. I really hope you take away a theme that, I mean, we are now meeting with cabinet ministers. We are meeting with MPs in a number of states, and there is an appetite for democratic innovation. And the number one thing you do is don't sit silent. You spread the word. There's a group for you to ask questions or, explore through demos, and Kyle is there. Kyle will respond as well. And we're trying to create this direct link between what we do in advocacy and research and what you can do as well. And that closing thought is just take a first step. That next article you see where there's 50 comments and most of them are people ranting and going crazy. If you're the reasonable voice, you will stand out. And one thing to be confident of is political advisors absolutely read that. So when they start to see there's many perspectives and there's a chance chance for a jury to explain. Your message carries a lot of a few minutes. When you take that action, tell others in the demos that you've done it, and that's a fabulous first step of showing people the small steps you can take. It's also a chance for us to monitor it and cover it and know which topics to pursue back on the political side. Thank you for bearing with us, and we'll continue the conversation online. Thanks again. Good night.